All right, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and get started now. I know Logan's got a very busy schedule with his classes just starting up and everything. He's got plenty to do as well this evening. For those of you that are watching with us this evening, as well as going to be watching later on our YouTube channel, our social media, thank you very much for being here. My name is Brett McAllister. I'm the Director for Graduate Admissions for Halmos College of Arts and Sciences. With me also is my Assistant Director, Miss Megan Troy, who will be joining us as well. She helps manage the department's recruitment process. I'm sure many of you have emailed back and forth there and talked about enrolling for our classes. So with us this evening, we have a very special guest that I'm very excited to introduce, Dr. Logan Bearden. He comes to us from Florida State University, where he received all three of his degrees, both his undergraduate degree, his MA degree, and his Ph.D. Dr. Bearden is an associate professor in the Department of Communications, Media, and the Arts. He teaches undergraduate composition course and graduate courses in the MA in Composition, Rhetoric, and Digital Media program. He received his Ph.D. in English, Rhetoric, and Composition from Florida State University in 2016. Dr. Bearden studies multimodal composition, programmatic curricular structures, and writing program administration. He has presented at regional, national, and international conferences, and his research has appeared in a variety of journals and magazines throughout the country, as well as various edited collections with his colleagues, Ms. Rachel Gramer and Derek Mueller. He's co-edited multiple books throughout his career. Short as it might seem, it has been incredibly productive, and we are very lucky to have him working with us here at Nova Southeast University. So Logan, with that being said, thank you once again so much for being here to do this lecture series tonight, and very excited to listen to all you have to offer, and take it away from there, Logan. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much to Brett and to Megan for setting this up and for inviting me to share my work with you all. And thanks so much to those of you in attendance. Over the last 30 years, actually, let me share my slides before I get too started. There we go. Over the last 30 years, the discipline of composition studies has attempted to expand the curricular circumference of composition, specifically first-year composition, to include more than just words on the page. Cynthia Self, for example, argued in 1999 about the perils the humanities face by not considering the ways in which digital technologies impact literate practices. 10 years later, in 2009, she went on to argue that when we insist on print as the primary and formally most acceptable modality for composing knowledge, we unwittingly limit students' sense of rhetorical agency. In other words, to teach alphabetic writing only in our composition courses is to limit the rhetorical potential of our students, especially in an increasingly digital world. So if we want to update first-year writing, first-year composition to be something that matters in the 21st century, we have to update the content of the curriculum itself. Composition studies has turned to the concept of multimodality to help integrate these new ways of composing into our curricula. Gunter Kress and others in the New London Group have claimed that the proliferation of digital technologies presents a need to develop new pedagogies and curricula to prepare students to participate in the global digital world by expanding the means of communication in which students are educated. Modes are the building blocks of multimodal theory, and Kress defines a mode as a socially situated resource for communicating and lists image, writing, speech, music, and gesture, including color, all as examples of modes. Each of these have different affordances, different grammars, and different ways of communicating meaning, which are shaped both by the histories of their materialities and the social value of those materialities. Multimodality, as both a term and a concept, has the ability to create more capacious composition programs by not prescribing the materials and media within which students work, thereby expanding their rhetorical potentials. Within this framework, alphabetic writing, words on a page, Times New Roman, 12-point font, all of that good stuff, is but one in a choice, a capacious repertoire of skills necessary for communicating. This approach destabilizes the privileged position of print literacy both in and out of the academy. So this is a pretty seismic shift. But unfortunately, we have not all succeeded in transforming our curricula and our programs to make space for these new ways of composing. Here at NSU, we've made this shift, absolutely, but at other institutions, the inclusion of multimodal composition is an individual instructor choice. and a choice that many instructors are reluctant to make for various reasons. To best prepare our students to compose, to persuade, to lead in the 21st century, we need an infusion of multimodal composition at the programmatic rather than the individual level. The problem with making it an individual choice is that instructors graduate, retire, find a different job, otherwise move and take their brilliant pedagogies and assignments with them when they go. So it has to be a programmatic restructuring. And this kind of programmatic restructuring that I'm envisioning here is what J. Palmieri has termed multimodal curricular transformation. Palmieri suggests that a transformed multimodal composition curriculum would include the following features: flexible ways for using multimodality as invention and revision techniques, engaging rhetorical concepts to compose multimodal texts, providing students with the opportunity to use multimodal text to cultivate digital literacies. So based on these features, multimodal curricular transformation does not mean ancillary low-stakes assignments tacked on at the end of the semester, which only work to reinforce the privileged position that print alphabetic writing possesses within the academy. So if you make a multimodal project only worth 10% at the end of the semester, the only thing that you're doing is reinforcing the fact that print is what really matters, not making and sharing meaning with a wide variety of tools, all of the tools that are available to us. Multimodal curricular transformation, on the other hand, describes a continual, intentional inclusion of multimodality throughout the curriculum and a redefinition of the work of composition from alphabetic writing to rhetoric, including the full available means of persuasion and requiring that students utilize multimodal composition to demonstrate rhetorical proficiency. It is not the inclusion of flashier digital technologies in first-year composition courses. It is a call to craft programs that reflect what we know and believe about literacy, about meaning-making, and that fostering the development of a capacious repertoire of rhetorical skills is necessary for students to be more effective and engaged citizens, especially in the 21st century. The question then becomes, how do we do this? How do we systematically and intentionally infuse new curricular elements into our programs? And this is a question that goes beyond just the scope of first-year composition. This can go to any academic program. How do we intentionally infuse new curricular elements into our programs? I propose that programmatic documents are one possibility. The language that we use in these documents, and those documents are things like mission statements, outcomes, assessment rubrics, assignment sheets. All of that language reveals and reinscribes what it is that we care for in our various programs. These documents play a vital role in the dynamic, reflective process of making and remaking curricula. So I think they can be one location where we can go to change what it is that we do within our programs. Today, I would like to discuss outcome statements, which operate at the intersection of local institutions and disciplinary expertise. Outcomes provide the textual rhetorical space for us to renegotiate and re-examine what our programs, what we claim we want our programs to help students know and do. In other words, they can make space for programmatic and curricular change. By looking at our outcomes, I argue, by looking at the language that we utilize to detail our values, we can notice and attend to the ways in which that language prevents us from positioning multimodal composing within the composition curriculum or positioning any content within any curriculum. And alternatively, we can see how we can revise that language to work toward multimodal curricular transformation or any other curricular transformation. This evening, I will share some of my findings from an analysis of a corpus of outcome statements. 1,353 outcomes collected from a total of 82 composition programs. I collected these to read across programs and institutions and outcomes to understand the language used to signal programmatic values and how that language might preclude or invite multimodal composition and consequently multimodal curricular transformation. This kind of analysis attempts what Dan Melzer terms a, quote, panoramic view, a perspective that, quote, pans wide enough that larger patterns in the landscape are revealed. Typically, the information that we share about what takes place in our programs comes from isolated examples presented as case studies, descriptions of individual programs, individual classrooms, individual students. Thus, my goal is to use the panorama, use this wide corpus of outcomes to gain cross-contextual and data-driven insights about outcomes, Hopefully, these insights are flexible enough to be adapted within various institutional types and programmatic structures. The 1,353 outcomes collected in this corpus depict a continuum of composition curricula. On one end, there are outcomes that define composition capaciously, including and perhaps requiring multimodal composition. But on the other end, there are outcomes that define the content of composition as alphabetic writing only. In tracing this continuum, I present the following findings that will be useful for folks interested in transforming their own curricula and their own programs. First, outcomes that define the content of composition as alphabetic writing only prevent us from working toward multimodal curricular transformation, while outcomes that define the content of composition in a more capacious manner make transformation possible. And two, this continuum does reveal possible alternatives to our program's current outcomes. So there is good news and ways that we can revise our language to work toward curricular transformation. Knowing this information gives program directors and invested stakeholders the power to revise their outcomes and their values, thereby working toward multimodal curricular transformation. So in my book project, I looked at 5 different kinds of outcomes, and you can see them on your screen now. But tonight, I only want to discuss what I find to be the 2 most illuminating kinds of outcomes: outcomes related to conventions of composition and outcomes related to multimodality. In the overall corpus, conventions-based outcomes appeared an average of 3.18 times per statement. Multimodality occurs the most infrequently. This is not surprising to me. I've spent a lot of time talking to folks about multimodality. Multimodal outcomes only averaged about 0.9 appearances per statement, which of course means that there were several programs that did not include multimodal composition in their values at all. In fact, 47 programs of the 82 included 0 multimodal outcomes. It appears that we still have a long way to go. So first, I'll discuss the multimodal outcomes, and then I'll move into conventions, because conventions can be particularly tricky. The analysis that I present in the book reinforces some previous findings of mine, specifically that even when we do include multimodal composition in our courses, we do not yet present a consistent definition of multimodality to students. In other words, what is the multimodal work that we want students to perform? We don't even have a consistent definition of that. Previously, I've isolated 4 types of multimodal outcomes. One is multimodality as the simple addition of another mode on top of the alphabetic writing curriculum, typically public speaking or contributing to a discussion, so including a presentation in the class or making participation part of the course grade. A second is multimodality as visual rhetoric, prescribing that image be the mode through which students communicate. A third is multimodality as digital or technological literacy, so working with digital technologies. And the last one is multimodality as material rhetorical flexibility. And this is where students make use of the full available means of communication appropriate for whatever the purpose and whatever the situation is that they're working in. That 4th category most closely resembles the definition of multimodality outlined in contemporary scholarship. So it's not just the mere inclusion of digital technology, but it's an attempt to cultivate in students a knowledge of the limitations and affordances of different composing materials, which allows them to make informed choices in their composing processes. To be sure, outcomes within this 4th category were present within the corpus. That's the study of the book, or that's the focus of the book. However, the other 3 categories were as well. And that suggests to me that those who are interested in working with multimodal composition and working toward multimodal curricular transformation ought to be mindful of the version of multimodality that they present to students. So I'll talk through just a couple of them and use a couple of examples to show you what I'm arguing here. So some outcomes conflate multimodality with visual rhetoric, which does expand the content of composition beyond alphabetic writing, beyond the page, or beyond the words on a page approach to composition, but it prescribes that students work within the visual, and that approach might have ableist implications, and it might also limit our students' rhetorical possibilities. For example, these kinds of outcomes ask students to, quote, collect, analyze, and organize research information in verbally and visually compelling ways. Understand how popular academic and/or technical ideas can be communicated visually, or use visual aids that are effective and compelling. The first outcome in that list implicitly argues that the verbal and the visual are the only two ways of communicating information, or are the only two acceptable ways to communicate information within the academy, which I think is probably more accurate. Outcomes like these ignore the larger repertoire of meaning-making possibilities available to students and instructors, things like sound, movement, gesture, all of those different things. A more capacious and less prescriptive outcome would remove those qualifiers and require only that students present information in compelling ways, regardless of mode and medium. The other two outcomes require that students work within the visual, but in so doing, they subordinate the visual to the verbal. Communicating ideas visually supposes that ideas are constructed verbally before being translated into the visual. And the term visual aids suggests that there's a more substantive verbal text doing more intensive meaning making somewhere elsewhere. These outcomes reinforce the position of power that alphabetic writing continues to have within the academy. If we are truly to achieve multimodal curricular transformation, we must ensure that the language utilized to manifest our values does not continue to position multimodal composition as ancillary or require visual rhetoric be the only way in which students compose multimodally. Additionally, despite its popularity within writing studies, visual rhetoric and its study operates from the ableist assumption, or it can operate from the ableist assumption, that all people access the visual or all people access it in the same way. This is a problem with multimodal theory in general, and a critique has been raised against this. Per Yergo et al., quote, multimodality as it is commonly used implies an ableist understanding of the human composer, end quote. This is a major issue for those of us who teach composition and work in composition programs because, and Yergo et al. Go on to say, quote, for educators, it is ethically questionable to practice pedagogies and construct spaces that categorically exclude entire classes of people. We need to pay attention to the teaching of composition through the lens of disability studies to remind ourselves of just how much our profession has to learn and just how much we have been content to ignore. In this important sense, disability studies reminds compositionists and our programs that our programs, curricula, and classes are designed to work only for some bodies, not for all bodies, end quote. In their current iterations, these kinds of outcomes lead to what Yergo et al. Call multimodal inhospitality, which, quote, occurs when the design and production of multimodal texts and environments persistently ignore access except as a retrofit. Retrofits are problematic because they tend to be added on only after complaints are lodged and determined to be legitimate, end quote. In the processes of multimodal curricular transformation, we must be mindful of the inhospitality of our outcomes and the version of composition and of multimodal composition that we present to students. Other outcomes within this category defined multimodal composition as digital literacy. Outcomes like these expect students to, quote, gain competence in using computer technology in the writing process. Use a range of available technologies to support their reading, writing, and thinking, including but not limited to email, word processing, and database searching. Use electronic environments for drafting, reviewing, revising, editing, and sharing texts, or develop technological literacies as they pertain to researching and composing in the 21st century. To be clear, digital literacy is important in the 21st century because not only has digital communication proliferated outside of the academy, but, quote, in less than 30 years, technology has become part of higher education. And in that short time, computer technologies have literally electrified writing instruction. Even if we teach in traditional classrooms, it is difficult to imagine writing instruction without computer technology and impossible to ignore its impacts on literacy, end quote. And that comes from Seidler et al. We cannot ignore the times. However, these kinds of outcomes place the focus on using technology in service of alphabetic writing. For example, in the outcome from Program 13, students are not engaging in computer technology critically to determine its rhetorical potentialities. Rather, they are gaining competence in service of the writing process, which in this program involves expressing your ideas with clarity and with effective syntax and punctuation. And I pulled that from elsewhere in their outcome statement. That's a very specific kind of alphabetic writing that you're using the computer to support. Similarly, in program 63, students are not considering the implications of their rhetorical choices with or within electronic media. They are using those media to, quote, develop polished essays. So, while these outcomes are indeed important for the current moment, the language utilized within them continues to privilege alphabetic writing, limiting the kinds of composing students are asked to do. In some programs, these were the only multimodal outcomes. It is possible, however, to craft digital literacy outcomes that also cultivate material rhetorical flexibility. So for an example, another program within the study, program 14, included an outcome that reads, quote, "You will have composed using digital technologies, gaining awareness of the possibilities and constraints of electronic environments," end quote. So while this does prescribe that students work with electronic digital tools, it also encourages students to learn the possibility and constraints of those different materials. In this program, students engage those differences rather than merely using the tools to perform alphabetic writing. So they're thinking about what those differences are and why they exist. If composition programs only have digital multimodal outcomes, I argue that program 14's outcomes provide a model that aligns with current trends in writing studies and can help us work toward multimodal curricular transformation. The last category, this is the most hopeful category of multimodal outcomes, presents a capacious version of multimodality and encourages rhetorical material flexibility in students. These outcomes, I argue, align most closely with the version of multimodality presented in contemporary scholarship. There were three that recurred frequently that fell within this category, and they read: understand and use a variety of technologies to address a range of audiences. So there's nothing prescribed there, just using a range of technologies for a range of audiences. To match the capacities of different environments to varying rhetorical situations, varying capacities, different, all of these are flexible. Adapt composing processes for a variety of technologies and modalities. All of these kinds of outcomes assist students in cultivating the knowledge necessary to engage in multimodal composition. In other words, material rhetorical flexibility and choice could be vital parts of multimodal curricular transformation. So it seems like, based on what I've found, that if we want to encourage in students the flexibility that they need to adapt to all of those different kinds of composing situations, they need to have choice. They need to not be prescribed to make a PowerPoint or write an essay. They need to be able to choose what kind of thing it is that they create, depending on their purpose, depending on their audience. So to summarize, in examining these varying kinds of multimodal outcomes, we find a couple of useful takeaways for those interested in pursuing multimodal curricular transformation. If we are to follow the lead of multimodal scholarship, we should strive toward valuing the robustness of multimodal composing, understanding the different strengths and weaknesses of different resources, including modes, media, genres, and employing those in a rhetorically strategic manner according to purpose and audience. Not least, multimodality continues to be undervalued in our programs. Like I said earlier, only, trying to do the math, 47 did not include it, so only a handful of programs or a few programs actually included multimodal composition. And I'm not arguing that all outcomes must make space for or account for multimodal composition, nor am I arguing that all programs should do so either. I do, however, want to illustrate that a good number of our outcomes in which we articulate our values and beliefs about composings require that students work with alphabetic writing only. And if the field is shifting toward a definition of composition that is capacious and expansive and flexible, but the outcomes and the language that we use to describe our values to our students still hinges upon alphabetic literacy, there's a disconnect, and that's a problem. If we wish to work toward multimodal curricular transformation, we must interrogate the assumptions underlying our outcomes and revise them accordingly. So I also looked at outcomes related to conventions of composing. The WPA outcome statement, which is a document released by the Council of Writing Program Administrators that articulates what it is at the national level we believe that programs should help students know and do by the end of their first year composition experience. So that document defines composing conventions as the, quote, formal rules and informal guidelines that define genres. And in so doing, these shape readers' and writers' perceptions of correctness and appropriateness. Most obviously, conventions govern such things as mechanics, usage, spelling, and citation practices. But they also influence content, style, organization, graphics, and document design. End quote. Yet while that document and other scholars account for more holistic rhetorical considerations in the shape and structure of texts, in practice, this category can be the most restrictive kind of outcome. Indeed, a majority of the outcomes in this corpus that were coded as conventions privileged mechanics, spelling, and citation practices, all of which prescribe a certain kind of academic alphabetic writing. Overall, there were 259 outcomes coded as conventions, and these occurred an average of 3.16 times per statement. While there were certain outcomes that make space for multimodality within those numbers, and those outcomes make space for multimodality by attending to the rhetorical structures of texts, depending on the rhetorical situation, just over half of these outcomes, so 133 of them, preclude multimodal composition entirely. And they necessitate a re-examination of the ways in which they continue to privilege alphabetic writing and privilege a very specific and exclusive kind of alphabetic writing. So the most restrictive conventions-based kinds of outcomes value correct grammar and usage in terms of alphabetic writing. If these outcomes signal, or if our outcomes signal and reinforce the values of our programs, then these outcomes define the work of composition as grammatically correct writing, an approach to composition that both precludes multimodal composing and perpetuates racist institutional practices. A few examples from within this category read: use correct syntax, grammar, and mechanics. Write grammatical sentences, whatever that means. Produce writing that is free of grammatical and mechanical errors that inhibit or interfere with the reader's understanding. Include few errors in grammar, punctuation, and usage. So in focusing on the form of writing, specifically achieving the correct grammatical form of writing, programs like these impose standards upon students under the guise of helping those students produce communication that does not inhibit the process of meaning making between readers and writers. So they're basically suggesting that, oh, if you write grammatically correct sentences, your meaning will come across clear, and that's not always the case. Many of the outcomes in this category require that students exhibit standard edited American English as a norm. Indeed, they have outcomes that read that students will, quote, apply the conventions of standard edited American English, or use syntactically fluent and lexically appropriate language that adheres to the conventions of standard written English to develop and support ideas. Another one reads that students should produce standard edited American English. Finally, one reads, follow the conventions of standard edited English, whatever those are. So there are several issues with these outcomes and the values that they manifest. By requiring that students work within the medium of print and requiring how they work within that medium, outcomes like these leave absolutely no space for multimodal composition, something that those of us who work within these programs should probably address if we want to work toward multimodal curricular transformation. They operate under the assumption that American English can actually be standard, ignoring the fact that regional dialects affect and influence meaning-making processes, and assuming that all parts of the academy communicate using the same English. That's just not the case. The larger issue here, though, is that enforcing students to learn and use standard American English or standard edited American English, and or to assess students according to that kind of English's expectations, is a direct violation of their rights to their own language. So in 1974, the Students' Right to Their Own Language position statement argued that there is no inherent prestige or value in standard American English. In holding students to the standards of standard American English, we invalidate their personal dialects. That's a significant issue because dialect is not separate from culture. It's an intrinsic part of it. Indeed, standard American English is more of an indication of cultural position or privilege than writerly aptitude. Geneva Smitherman writes that, quote, most of these students, and she's talking about those who entered the university in the 1960s and 70s, however bright, did not have a command of the grammar and conventions of academic discourse in standard English. Yet they often had other communicative strengths, creative ideas, logical and persuasive reasoning powers, innovative ways of talking about the ordinary and the mundane, end quote. So the statement on students' rights was developed as a way to navigate this tension between the academy and the students that were entering into the academy. Further, the C's, that's the Conference on College Composition and Communication statement on anti-Black racism and Black linguistic justice addressed this issue again in the summer of 2020. And that document demanded that, quote, teachers and researchers acknowledge that socially constructed terms such as academic language and standard English are false and entrenched in notions of white supremacy and whiteness that contribute to anti-Black linguistic racism, end quote. So such statements are necessary because racism via the imposition of standard American English persists everywhere. Asao Inoue calls this, or states that, quote, racism in schools and college writing courses is still persuasive because most, if not all, writing courses, including my own in the past, promote or value first a local standard American English and a dominant white discourse, end quote. Within this system, Inoue says, students of color, quote, are often hurt by conventional writing assessment that uncritically uses a dominant discourse. So there's a certain amount of violence in holding students accountable to a standard that they might not have ever experienced before getting to the academy. Stacey Perriman Clark says that, quote, decisions about writing assessment are rooted in racial and linguistic identity. We cannot separate assessment from race. The consequences for many writing assessment decisions are often reflective of the judgments made about who does and does not deserve opportunities for success, opportunities historically denied to students of color and linguistically diverse writers. Put simply, assessments create or deny opportunity structures, end quote. Thus, not only do these outcomes do our students a disservice, but they also perpetuate racist institutional practices. And I think we would all probably like to do away with that. In moving our outcomes and our values away from standard American English, we can simultaneously work against these racist systems and work toward multimodal curricular transformation. So the culmination of multimodal curricular transformation is what the New London group termed transform practice, quote, in which students transfer and recreate designs of meaning from one context to another, end quote, using necessarily multimodal means. This practice makes them more effective communicators in a global digital world. That kind of cross-cultural communication and negotiation resists the supremacy of standard American English. Being proficient in only one way of communicating is simply not enough for communicators in the 21st century. Multimodal curricular transformation, because it encourages students to cultivate material rhetorical flexibility and the adaptability to communicate, or the ability to communicate with multiple audiences, multimodal curricular transformation provides us a way to work against the fiction that describes a linguistically homogeneous situation, that of standard American English. In other words, we can reject and challenge racist institutional practices by accepting and validating in our outcomes and in our pedagogical practices ways of communicating outside of standard American English and alphabetic writing. So while the outcomes detailed above were certainly the majority of those coded within this category of conventions, there were possibilities. There were outcomes that were capacious enough to foster, if not require, multimodal composition. For example, a few of them read, quote, provide an understanding of the conventions of multimodal composition that comprise developing communication in the 21st century, or to apply conventions of format, design, and structure appropriate to the rhetorical situation. So it's not prescribing a format or a specific structure. It's saying that you will apply expected conventions within whatever structure you choose as the most appropriate, or to use conventions of format and structure appropriate to the rhetorical situation, or present information in a succinct, smooth, and logical manner. I love that one because it is completely non-prescriptive. It's open, it's flexible. So these are rhetoric-based outcomes that foster multimodality. They do not prescribe the materials, media, or modes in which students work. Rather, they focus instead on students making their own material, rhetorical, structural choices that are appropriate to their given rhetorical situations. These kinds of outcomes make space for multimodal curricular transformation by strengthening students' understandings of rhetoric, thereby making them more effective and adroit composers. So our programmatic documents, as I've argued here, provide a textual and rhetorical space for those involved in the administration and delivery of academic programs to renegotiate curricular content and programmatic values. As such, they are an excellent starting point for something like multimodal curricular transformation. So in this presentation, I turned to outcomes as an illustration of this capability. By reading across the outcomes in this corpus, I raised concerns about the spectrum of language that we use to articulate and communicate the content of first-year composition to our students and to other stakeholders outside of the institution. On one end of the spectrum that I've presented here, we have outcomes that define the content of composition as alphabetic writing, prescribing the medium in which students work and consequently precluding multimodal composing. Outcomes on the other end of the spectrum define multimodal composing more capaciously as the making and sharing of meaning with the full available means of persuasion. And that invites and perhaps requires multimodal composition. So we want that flexibility, we want that capaciousness. The values manifested by this end of the spectrum, it should be clear, are those that multimodal curricular transformation makes possible, allowing us the opportunity to present to students a theoretically robust curriculum informed by cutting-edge scholarship. To recap briefly, we must strive to present a consistent version of multimodality to students. Digital literacy and visual rhetoric are important, but multimodal outcomes do their best work when they ask students to consider the rhetorical potentialities of different materials and then engage those potentialities in practice. Additionally, conventions-focused outcomes can be particularly problematic for first-year composition programs working toward multimodal curricular transformation because the application of conventions can lead to an overemphasis on correct standard American English. In other words, these outcomes can prescribe a kind of academic writing that participates in racist institutional structures. However, conventions outcomes can foster multimodal composing and deeper compositional understanding by emphasizing that textual structures depend on rhetorical situations and by not prescribing the materials within which students work. In the end, I believe that we must have a conversation about language and the terms that define us, especially within composition studies. Specifically, we must reevaluate our uses of the terms compose composition and write writing. Some scholars perceive writing as a term that is capacious enough to include multimodal composition. So Cheryl Ball and Colin Charlton offer, quote, all writing is multimodal, end quote, as a threshold concept in writing studies. In their description of this concept, they write, quote, there is no such thing as a monomodal text. This assumption is a throwback to the romantic version of writing focused solely on alphanumeric textual production and analysis, end quote. In this way, all writing is multimodal, and writing as a term describing what we do in first-year composition includes multimodal composing. Similarly, Sid Dobrin, in outlining a vision for the future of composition studies, eschews the term composition entirely. Composing, he writes, is, quote, an act that is chained to an understanding of student subjects performing an act, often only as an academic performance. Writing, on the other hand, he says, is a phenomenon that requires the attention of intellectual and scholarly inquiry and speculation beyond composition, so beyond the content of that first-year composition classroom. Writing, he says, is more than composition studies, end quote. In focusing on the performance of student subjects within composition, Dobrin believes that composition studies possesses an, quote, inability to articulate an intellectual focus beyond the training of teachers, an activity set in the service of the continued management of student bodies, end quote. The study of writing that he proposes includes the study of the complexity and the flow of texts within networks and activity. So per Dobrin, writing is the more capacious, more rigorous, and more appropriate term than composition. Lenny Irvin describes a similar approach in one program's shift in name from first-year composition to first-year writing. Irvin argued that, quote, the name freshman composition, first-year composition, still evokes the frame in the mind of students, administrators, and the public that this course is a skills course. And those of us who teach first-year writing are intimately familiar with that. A skills course focusing on correctness in the mechanics and conventions of writing. However, the term first-year writing expresses a broader conception of genres available for a writing course, the significance of inquiry, and the representation of writing as an intellectual practice rather than a mere skill. Within these perspectives, writing is the more capacious and generative term. Other scholars opt for composition. Kathleen Blake Yancey, for example, has articulated a new composition, a new definition, one that, quote, includes rhetoric and is about literacy. New composition includes the literacy of print. It adds on to it and brings the notion of practice and activity and circulation in media and screen and networking, all of those, to our conceptions of process, end quote. These examples reveal and reinforce what is a central issue in the outcomes that I looked at. Our published works reveal that we possess and operate from a robust conceptualization of writing, the term writing as more than just alphabetic literacy, and as something that includes the content of first-year composition as well. However, the outcomes that I presented in my talk tonight reveal that in local programs, writing continues to mean invoke and privilege alphabetic writing only. So Dobrin, Ball, Charlton, Irvin, all of their ideas of writing, that's not the same version that we present to students. We cannot assume that our definitions and our terms are shared, and we must acknowledge this disconnect between our published works, which are by necessity cutting edge and current, and our composition programs, which can remain fairly conservative in the version of composition that they present to students. In acknowledging this disconnect, we can see that there is more work that needs to be done, particularly in and around the language that we use to describe what it is that we do. I mentioned outcomes as one possibility of this, but we should all be re-examining our mission statements, our websites, our assignment sheets, our assessment rubrics, all of the documents that make and define us, to see what language it is that we're using to describe what it is that we do, and how that language might be inhospitable to certain students, how that language might perpetuate inequalities, how that language might preclude certain kinds of curricular content from being included within the classroom. So I'm hopeful that what I've shared this evening can provide us with a way forward, thinking about the language that we use to describe what it is that we do and thinking carefully about it. And hopefully in so doing, we can craft better programs for our students in their futures. Thank you so much.
Awesome, Logan. Thank you so much for speaking with me this evening. That was absolutely fascinating to listen to. And we do have a question as well. Honestly, I'm glad they asked because I was going to if they did not. And it definitely centers around something that those of us working in higher education and education in general are going to be involved with a lot. And that's the big question of general AI being used at the education setting. So I'll read the question. I'm very interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. So what impact do you see Gen AI having on MCT? This is a big question, obviously, and may not really have an answer yet, but I'm interested in your perspective. So Logan, what are your thoughts about that?
So I don't have anything that's necessarily fully formed yet, but I was thinking about this issue earlier today. So I'm teaching UNIV, the first year experience course this semester, and one of the assignments, or several of the assignments, ask students to go out and collect experiences on campus. So one of the projects is something called Beyond the Classroom, where they're required to attend an event like Sharkapalooza or a talk on campus or something like that. And then the assignment that everyone uses, so all of these assignments are standard across UNIV, is a written reflection. So 300 to 500 words that the students write up about their experience. My students heard that assignment and were like, I don't want to write that essay, like that doesn't appeal to me. What if I made a video instead about my experience? What if I recorded myself talking before the event, recorded myself while I was there, and did like a reflective follow-up after? And I was like, that sounds fantastic to me. I'm never going to prescribe, because my philosophy is never to prescribe the materials with which students work. But I have heard folks say, I'm so worried, or other teachers say, I'm so worried about the students using Gen AI to write those reflective essays. And my students opted for something that I think prevents them from using Gen AI. They wanted something that felt more personal and connected to them. And because it was personal and connected to them, I don't think they're going to feel the temptation to use something as a way to get away from the intellectual work of the task. So for me, and I don't know if there's any way that this can be proven, but for me, I have a hunch, and an instinct that multimodal composition, allowing students to make really informed choices about what it is that they create for an assignment and why they're creating that, I think that that is going to be a way that we sort of fight back against the power of Gen AI, because they're not going to be using that to make those TikTok videos about their experience at Sharkapalooza. They can't. It has to be made by them. It's only when they're forced to work in a certain kind of material, when they're forced to produce academic writing, when they feel the desire to go elsewhere and to find those little workarounds, right? So I don't know if we can necessarily say that multimodality is going to save us, that multimodal curricular transformation is the way to protect us against Gen AI, but my students chose for something that prevented them from making that choice. And I think that other students would like that too. I think that the power of the tool is its ability to do the function of academic writing, of standard edited American English, which they feel is so counter to the communicative practices that they use on a daily basis. So they only go to those things when they feel overwhelmed, unsure, they don't know what to do. That's when they reach out to those sorts of technologies. And I don't think that they can if they're doing something that's multimodal. Of course, they can use the art function to create whatever image, just type in a situation that will produce a bunch of different images, but making their own videos, they can't really do that. So I think it's one possibility in protecting ourselves against this thing that does, I think, pose a pretty interesting and enormous challenge to the institution at this time.
Logan, while you were talking, I'm also teaching our UNIV course this semester. And while you were talking, I was literally thinking about, okay, I just talked to my students about this reflection that they have to write. And I really was wishing I could be like, you don't have to write it. Let's think of other creative ways. And I think you've given me the confidence to go to my class on Friday and give them a better option if they don't necessarily want to write. I know I have some talented students in my course, and I've heard all of the talents that they have, and to think that I could probably tell one of them, write a song. I know you like to play guitar. That I think you just like made my stress level of thinking about students all going to the same events and writing the exact same reflection of a paper versus maybe giving them the opportunity to be a little bit more creative with another way of trying to convey their message. I really appreciate that, because as you were talking, I was just like, oh my gosh, I wish I could think of things like this. And you just gave that to me. So I appreciate that.
Thanks so much. And it makes it so much more personal for them. Like, it's really hard for students to see themselves in writing, but they can see themselves in the images that they create. So another kind of text that is pretty common both in like first year writing courses and in something like a first year experience course is a like a weekly journal where you reflect on your experiences and things like that. My students, when I floated that idea to them, hated it, of course, because it's writing feels foreign to them. So I said, okay, instead, let's make a digital scrapbook where you take 5 pictures of what it is that you're doing this week. And it could be a project that you're working on. It can be you're studying in the library. It can be an image of a website that whatever you're doing to enroll in early immersion, that kind of platform and technology. It doesn't have to be that. And some of them, the requirement is 5, they're doing 25 posts per week. So they see themselves in it, and that makes them care about it so much more. And that's the inspiring part to me. And for folks who might feel reluctant or resistant to try this because I don't know how to make a video, and I certainly don't know what makes one video better than the next, they can tell me. The way that I've always taught these kinds of assignments, the way that I learned about how Twitter functions 10 years ago, how I learned what Tumblr was at all, was from my students who brought these things to the classroom and taught me that there are new technologies of composing. There are new ways of us making and presenting our arguments, and we care about those more than we care about your little 8 to 10 page research essay, right? So they're allowed to make those choices, and they should be allowed to make those choices, because then they care about it, they're invested in it, and they can take that. So some of my students have made Tumblr accounts or social media campaigns that they kept up with for like a year or 2 years after the class. How often does that happen with a research paper? It doesn't happen very often. right? So if we give them the chance to make the choice, then we give them the chance to become invested in their own education in a different kind of way. And I think that's super important.
Absolutely, Logan. And we do have another question, but kind of just staying on the similar topic we were just talking about. I do think it's kind of spreading out beyond just the education side for what you guys do as teachers. I know from us from the admissions side, we've seen a variety of changes in the actual admissions process. We're no longer so rigid about just your GPA or just your GRE test score or your GMAT score. We are looking at the whole student. Which is a kind of allowing that freedom for the students to write their lecture, write their resumes in there and write their writing samples and kind of give them that freedom to show, more of who they are than just go write a paper or go get a specific GPA. And it's really allowing us to get a really interesting variety of students across the board at the university that it's definitely beneficial. And I love hearing faculty members talk about this, trying to work with students to find new ways to get them engaged and not feel bored in classrooms. And that's something it's great to hear. So that's awesome, Logan. Thank you. And Megan, good luck with your class on Friday. We do have a question as well coming in, so I will read it out loud. So do you think that RetComp should move toward a stable or singular understanding of multimodality or composition or writing? You mentioned that locally programs tend towards slightly more conservative approaches. Do you think that having different definitions helps practitioners and programs maintain the more conservative approach? Sorry if that's a little confusing from the questionnaire.
It's terribly fraught and terribly complicated, because I do think that I have a personal investment in us maintaining composition as our key term, because I think that implies the expansive flexibility that we need to give to students, because there's a certain amount of communication that our programs have internally, and there's a certain amount of communication that we do to external audiences. And I worry that if we use writing to talk about what it is that we do, external audiences will think alphabetic writing because they think they know what that means. So in terms of a consistent definition, I think that composition serves us better. I also think that imposing a standard definition could take away from the local flair of programs. So some programs use the term composing, some use multimodality actually in their outcomes, some use writing, some use digital literacy, but all of them are getting at the same kind of idea, which is that students make something that's not just an essay. For me, I think that there's value in composing. I think that there's value in us thinking about the term. I'm hesitant to say that one term is the one that local programs need to choose. And here's why. The reason that those local programs still operate from a conservative definition and understanding of composition, one that's limited to alphabetic writing, is because the majority of composition classes are staffed by folks who are contingent faculty. They teach at multiple locations. They're paid very little per section. They don't have the means or the opportunity to stay current in terms of what writing means to the field of those of us who study writing. They don't have the opportunity to go to conferences and hear about multimodal composition. And if they do, they go and hear the term in a presentation like mine, and they're like, okay, great, but can you give me an example of multimodal assignment? I need help. So there's all of these different factors that influence the conservatism of our programs. And I think a lot of it has to do with our teaching faculty, and that's not their fault. That's not their problem. We want to make sure that those who are delivering composition to students are well taken care for, but that also means that sometimes those conservative programs are a few years behind where the rest of the field is, because the folks who are actually doing the groundwork of teaching composition don't have the resources that they need to understand what multimodality is. So in that regard, I'd also say that composition is a good term. I am reluctant to say multimodal composition to folks who have never heard it before, because they struggle with the term, they struggle with the concept, and really all I'm talking about is the radical idea that we let students make and share meaning with more than just words. So I honestly worry that multimodality as a term is not as useful as we want it to be. As a theory, it's really helpful in understanding the different strengths and weaknesses of materials. But as a term, I think it might be a barrier to folks understanding what it is that we're trying to talk about. So I don't know if I got to the answer of the question, but I do know I have a lot of thoughts about the names that we use to talk about what it is that we do, and that sometimes terms can get in the way of us doing that work. Terms like writing can communicate externally something that we don't necessarily want to communicate, and multimodality can keep people away. So I think that we have to be really careful and critical about the terms that we use.
They did follow up and say thank you for answering the question. So you must have nailed exactly what they were looking for. So they're thanking that it's very informative and very interesting, and I would definitely agree. I do have a question, Logan. Obviously, just kind of listening. So for our potential students that are out there looking to go back to grad school and looking to move into this kind of field of work, what's some advice you can give them when they're really looking at our program in particular for what you guys offer our students?
I mean, the honest answer is we offer something we offer something that is pretty unique in the field. The composition, rhetoric, and digital media program is unlike a lot of other programs. You can't get the background in technical and professional writing in multimodal composition. We have one of the few graduate classes in the country that uses the term multimodality in its course title. You can get experience in teaching and working in the writing center. The CRDM program here has unique opportunities. There's all kinds of organizational affiliations that our students have. A lot of our students last year, even our undergraduate students, went to a writing center conference and presented their work with faculty members. So there's a network and a community here that doesn't exist elsewhere. You won't find the support that you'll get here. I came from another institution where the community amongst faculty did not exist. So here, not only is everyone supportive, they're all really eager to work with each other and to work with you. So if you come to the CRDM program, you will be uniquely positioned to go out into the world with a better understanding of what it means to compose in the 21st century, and you'll leave with a network of resources available to you. So this program is unique in that capacity.
Awesome, Logan. Well, thank you very much for being here with us this evening. I'm sure you got a lot to do, so I try and keep this right around an hour for you as well, as our semester is very often running right now. So for those of you that are watching from home, and will be watching on our YouTube channel later, once again, my name is Brett McAllister. I'm the director for graduate admissions here. With me, as always, is Miss Megan Troy, one of my assistant directors. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach back out to us through our email, any of our social media accounts that this is posted on, or our general website as well. And there are plenty of other faculty members along with Logan that they love to talk to students. So if you are interested in speaking with our faculty members to kind of get a better idea, I know Logan just gave a great answer for what we offer here, but if you want more information, they love talking to potential students. Even if you don't end up coming here, they want to work with you. And that's something that I have worked at different universities throughout the country. I know Megan has as well. It is a very rare thing to have such a group of faculty that just love talking about their work. They are just so excited about their research and everything that they get to do here at the university. So thank you once again for being here, Logan. For those of you watching, thank you for being with us this evening. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And Logan, I look forward to seeing you around campus and everywhere else. So take care, guys. Hope you have a great night. Thank you so much.